Good evening, everyone. This evening, I will be discussing Chapter 4 and 5. Chapter 4, Re-evaluating the link between disasters and psychopathology. So, how do we know whether a response to trauma is pathological in its immediate aftermath? The immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, most people will exhibit symptoms such as difficulties in sleeping and concentrating, irritability, nightmares, having recurrent thoughts about the trauma, or experiencing distress at being reminded of the event. But these symptoms will not last for a long time. So, the main topic here is about PTSD, uh, post-traumatic distress disorder. So, a major challenge of coping with PTSD is sensitivity to triggers, physical and emotional stimuli that the brain associates uh, with the original trauma. This can be everyday sensations that are not inherently dangerous. For example, the smell of campfire could evoke the memory of being trapped in a burning house. So maybe pag maybe na siya past na nasunugan silag balay. Then pag makakita siya og uh, mga like mga fire, sumot ang maka-trigger sa iya. So next one is what kind of responses to trauma should mental health practitioners be concerned about? So in most discussion of long-term pathologic responses following a traumatic event, this is an implicit assumption that the critical outcome being referred to is PTSD. Yet, PTSD is but one among several possible outcomes following trauma exposure. So, for someone with PTSD, that memories activates the same neurochemical cascade as the original event. So, we have a intrusive symptoms. Intrusive symptoms could be having emotional bodily reaction such as heart rate. When you see a reminder of the event, it could be traumatic memories and nightmares which stop you from sleeping. So, mga nightmares, siguro na sila like nahitabo sila before, like na-rape sila, or gi-abuso sila, like mga ana. So, mahimo to nila, madamgo-damgohan to nila na ilang past. So then, does the PTSD diagnosis effectively classify symptomatic person post-trauma? When PTSD was established as a diagnosis in 1980, it was not conceptualized as a pathologic response, but rather as a normative response to abnormal circumstances of extreme trauma. Uh, PTSD was considered represents psychopathology only in so far as this normative response resulted in a maladaptive complex of symptoms. So ang PTSD kay naa siya requirement na dapat kato na symptoms is for 1 month. Nagre-prolong siya for 1 month. So para ma-consider siya nato siya na PTSD, ang mga symptoms ana is nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance behavior, meaning dili sila gusto moadto sa isa ka place na mapa-remind sa ilahang past, something ana, or sa ilang trauma. Nindot yun siya pag naay nindot yun pag naa sila'y always naga-istorya sa ilaha, ato nga situation para mas ma-control nila ang ilang fear. So, mas ma-control nila ilang kahadlok sa ilang past. So, next one is core predictors of chronic dysfunction in the acute phase. So, numerous studies have found relationship between peritraumatic dissociation and the subsequent development of PTSD. One recent meta-analysis reported that peri-traumatic dissociation was the single best predictor of subsequent PTSD developed among the trauma-exposed individuals. Next one is pre-traumatic risk for the development of post-traumatic mental health problems. Uh, it appears on the basis of retrospective studies that those at the greatest risk for developing PTSD following trauma are persons with a family history of psychopathology, like child abuse, prior trauma exposure, cognitive factors such as lower IQ, female in some circumstances, and poor social support. Next is biological correlates of acute post-traumatic predictors of chronic symptoms development. Basic science research on memory, consolidation, and fear conditioning during states of heightened arousal is consistent that peritraumatic panic or even intense distress during immediately after a traumatic event might contribute to the production of intrusive recollections. The, then the role of biological studies in helping to identify pathology responses. Biological findings in PTSD have become increasingly relevant to the issue of the identification of psychopathology. Initially, the biology of stress and the stress response was adopted as a relevant model of the study of PTSD. This assumption provided the intellectual justification of interpreting PTSD as one manifestation along a continuum of normal responses to diversity. Next is general mechanisms whereby biological findings in PTSD might reflect a an pathophysiology of the disorder. In tandem with observation of the phenomenology and psychology of PTSD, neurobiological examination of trauma survivors have supported the possibility that the development of PTSD is facilitated by a failure to contain the normal stress response at the time of the trauma, resulting in cascade of biological alterations that eventually underlie the enhanced recall, distress at reminder avoidance, the hyperarousal symptoms that characterize PTSD. Next one is specific mechanism potentially contributing to the pathophysiology of PTSD. While the precise mechanism whereby even well-established biological risk factors may influence a person's acute response to trauma have not yet been fully elaborated, it is important to consider responsibilities with respect to the neuroendocrine alteration. For example, since cortisol inhibits its own release through negative feedback na at the level pituitary and the hypothalamus, lower circulating cortisol levels of disrupt or delay the process of physiological stress recovery by failing to inhibit the activation of the hypothalamus or pituitary. Then biological risk, factors contributing to PTSD. If there is a predisposing biology of PTSD, it appears to comprise a set of conditions that impede an individual's ability to contain the stress response. According to the cascade described above, trauma exposure will further the develop of these conditions and consequences, resulting in a progressive sensitization to subsequent trauma exposure. It is conceivable that any one of a number of biological conditions could have the effect of stimulating or sustaining a heightened level of physiological arousal, and consequently distress, at the time of the traumatic experience, and thereby or facilitating a biological sensitization of subsequent traumatic events. So, implications of biological findings in PTSD for strategies of for pharmacological prophylaxis. The biological condition that appear to promote the development of PTSD suggest two promising strategies of pharmacological prophylaxis. The first is to develop intervention aimed at diminishing adrenergic hyperactivity. Two trials have been initiated to date using propranolol for this purpose.